Hi, everyone, and welcome to Body Love and the New Kitchen Way to Eating for Wellness. I'm Mary Collette Rogers, Healthy Eating Companion, and I'm here today with Terri Leichty, author of Body Love, Food Peace, 10 Practices to End the War. We're here today for a conversation about our work in the food world. And although we work in pretty different areas, there are some interesting connections in our messages. So we'd like to share them with you and see what you think. So if we're talking about something that rings a bell for you, or if you have something to add, or something to help us see things from a different perspective, do be sure to leave a comment below. So to start, we're going to share a little bit about ourselves and so you can get to know us. I've been involved in the area for over 25 years. It started when my children and I faced some serious health issues when they were very young. We were able to heal ourselves and become healthy, happy people again, largely through the simple but amazingly powerful remedy of a good diet. So ever since then, I've dedicated myself to sharing the good news about this powerful remedy. But my focus has been a little different than many people in the food and nutrition area. Most of those professionals focus on what we should be eating, like what kinds of fats, if any, what vegetables are good for us, what nutrients we need, whether we should be eating carbs, and so on. On the other hand, I focus on how to make those recommendations a reality in your life. So like when you sit down to eat and you look at your plate, do the foods on your plate match what the nutrition experts advise? And more importantly, are they foods you want to be eating to best serve your health? So I've always called myself a healthy eating implementer. And I've worked to come up with tools and skills, systems, and strategies that could help us translate good eating advice into real meals on the table. I've combined the best of these tools and other resources into an integrated approach to meal making that I call the New Kitchen Way. And this approach helps ordinary home cooks turn meal making into something that's totally manageable. So you can really make meals that are yummy and wholesome and satisfying and do so in a way that's just natural, no big deal, just a regular part of your day. The New Kitchen Way does this by addressing three main areas of meal making. And it offers new ways of doing things in those areas. So first, I offer classes about how to be new in the kitchen so that you don't get bogged down by all the usual kitchen barriers. Like your kitchen's a time trap. You can't figure out what to make. You don't know how to make it. You don't have the right ingredients. You don't have the equipment, and on and on and on. Next, my programs teach you how to be new in your cooking. I help you recover from the many years of convenience eating that have robbed us of the capability, the confidence, and just the plain motivation to make our own meals from real whole foods. And then finally, and this is something that might sound unusual, but I also help us be new in our thinking. We've been conditioned to believe in a useless and self-serving food culture that doesn't support our efforts to eat for wellness. So a big part of my work lies in introducing a new, more helpful way of thinking that I call the New Kitchen Culture. And I'll be talking about that more in just a minute. So at all three of these levels, the kitchen, the cooking, and our thinking, I've developed all sorts of products and services, from software to books and from an online magazine to both online and live classes. But the one area that I never delved into is the emotional piece. And I know the kitchen, cooking, and food often carry some heavy emotional baggage. And that can be a real big barrier to making the good meals we want to be eating. But this just isn't an area where I have expertise. So that's why I'm so glad to have Terri with me today, because she's delved into this area and has some really valuable insights. So Terri, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today. So first, my background, I grew up in a household where food was central to pretty much every activity we did. And from a young age, I just remember things being very focused on eating. And at some point, I started to use food to cope with painful emotions, things I didn't know how to express. I would kind of comfort myself with food. And I began to focus on my body and it being kind of what defined my self-worth. I thought if I could just get thin enough or fit enough, I'd be acceptable and be okay. And so for me, personally, it got pretty extreme. For about 30 years, I was on a pretty agonizing roller coaster of craving and binging, and then exercising to try purging calories, and constant dieting and obsessing about my body, what I saw as imperfections. And it's sad as I look back. I feel like I lost years of my life pouring my energy into these things and just really ignoring my soul's cry for attention and affirmation. So in my many years of work as a health coach and wellness coach, I heard a lot of stories from women and wrote a book last summer called Body, Love, Food, Peace, 10 Practices to End the War. And what I wanted to offer is an intuitive approach to eating and self-love, learning to care for and treasure the body that you have. And it's about ditching diets and all those body expectations that are all set by these outside influences and learning to listen to what you need. And everyone's different, and we all have different needs and preferences. And so learning to tune into those and really make some choices based on what we hear from what our body's telling us.
Oh, that sounds so interesting. And I think everyone's going to really enjoy hearing more about that. But you can see what I mean. We definitely both work in the eating area, but our angles are pretty different. So what brings us together in this podcast? Well, we've been having some fun conversations exploring that question, and we found actually a lot of ways in which we support and complement each other. And we want to share 3 of those today. The first has to do with food culture. We hope to help you see the damaging effects of our food culture and how it acts as a barrier to eating well, and how can we get around that. The second has to do with freedom and helping us see that there is such a thing as food freedom, and how can we achieve what Terri calls a freedom and lightness around food. I love that phrase. The third has to do with healthy eating and helping us better understand how we can journey to a place where we're eating both comfortably and in a way that serves our health. So let's start with the first of those areas, the damaging effects of our food culture. I'm sure you've heard the phrase toxic food environment and how we live in a toxic food culture. Well, usually this refers to how we're continuously bombarded with food options that don't support our well-being. Everywhere you turn, there's some highly processed foods being pitched at you with nothing to recommend them and plenty to harm your body. And living in this kind of food culture makes it really hard to eat in a way that supports good health. So this is the usual interpretation of toxic food culture. But Terri and I have found that there are additional aspects of our food and eating culture that compound the problems with eating well. So Terri, do you want to start this section by explaining what you've discovered in this area? And does it have anything to do with that subtitle of your book, 10 Practices to End the War?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that because I think there's a food culture and there's also a body culture. And that's where you and I found so many areas of commonality, is that our culture is clear to us. There's this message to women that our worth is found in our appearance. And so to meet these beauty standards that have been set for us of thinness and fitness, we diet and we obsess about food. And so food becomes this nemesis instead of using it to sustain our life, keep us healthy and feeling well, and giving us energy to do the things we feel passionate about. It becomes this enemy that it stands in the way of our feeling acceptable and worthwhile. And so we forget about things that really matter in our life, like pursuing our passions and our life purpose and things we love. And our energy is diverted instead to reaching for this impossible standard we've been told equals our worth and value as women. And so that's the food and the body, that body image, it's all so tied together so tightly.
This is such an interesting message to me, and I know that already, right in the first paragraph of the book, I was highlighting in particular that I wanted to share because it was so enlightening. It said, you say, and I'm quoting now, "This work is about a shift from using food as an emotional crutch to using it as intended to sustain your life," which is kind of what you're just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like such obvious common sense. But somehow we've got really far from food being the staff of life to now, where it is often a destructive emotional crutch.
Yeah, and it's such a shame because food can also be such a joyful experience, and so I think that's what you and I are, both you and I, our work is about reaching that place again. And in my book, I talk about some traits that help us be successful on this food and body. I call it like a peace path. This path to feeling peaceful about food in our body, and one is righteous anger, and I see that as just deciding to refuse acceptance of this myth about women's bodies, this perfect body myth. When I stopped in my own personal journey, when I stopped accepting as fact that my body needed to look a certain way, be a certain level of fitness, I really took back my personal power, and not only about my body, but about what I was going to eat and what the choices were that I made. And that's this authentic conversation started with my body. It may sound funny, but just communicating with my body about what it wanted, what it needed, rather than what it could or couldn't have. So rather than making choices based on fear of weight gain or not meeting that impossible mythical standard we've been talking about, I started to make choices based on what made me feel strong, made me feel healthy, made me feel good. And it's a huge shift, and it changes everything.
I love that you said I started having a conversation with my body,
Hmm.
and that may sound funny, and indeed it does.
Hmm.
But isn't that where we need, instead of letting outside external forces determine what we're going to go do and how we're going to be, instead we listen to us.
Yeah, exactly. And we do have this inner wisdom. I mean, who knows our body better than we do? And so just having initially that conversation was literally out loud with my body. It was just a very basic start to yeah, and we're going to talk later about the fact that it's a journey, but the journey started with asking out loud, wow, what do you need right now? Because I have no idea. So, and Mary, it seems like you've discovered a similar problem around making healthy meals. Our culture is doing everything possible to keep us from doing that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Just like you just talked about the culture of thin and beautiful, there are equally harmful cultural messages around meal making. And those messages run the gamut from things like, oh, cooking takes too long and nobody has time to cook, to things like cooking's too expensive, it's too hard, too dowdy and old fashioned, my life is too busy. These kinds of statements have come to be unquestioned cultural assumptions. And underlying them all seems to be one unspoken belief that cooking just isn't worthy of our precious time. We have more important things to do than spend time in the kitchen. Well, I've come to realize this cultural piece now, but for my first dozen years in the healthy eating area, I thought we just lacked the physical skills and tools to make good meals. So I started out just re-empowering home cooks on a physical or mechanical level. And those are the first two parts of the new kitchen way I described earlier, reskilling people in the cooking basics and introducing them to the kitchen fundamentals that we've lost over the years. And those mechanical skills are absolutely critical. But I eventually came to realize that they weren't enough, because first you have to go to the kitchen. And I realized there was a big unseen barrier, kind of like a wall blocking the door to the kitchen. And that wall was the collection of all the negative messages our culture was giving us around cooking. And this really hit me in particular after one conversation. I'd just been finished up a cooking class, and one participant stayed after to talk about her situation. Turns out she was a single mom, had a daughter. Her job required a lot of driving around the metro area, and so she often got home late. And of course, had trouble getting meals on the table. And of course, the problem, as she identified it, was time. I just don't have time to cook, she said. So we brainstormed, and I kept offering her different solutions to work around her time issue. But I'd offer solution after solution, and her response was always, no, that won't work. I don't have time for that. That won't work. And she finally gave up and left, having just resigned herself to the fact that she would never have time to make health-giving meals for her and her daughter. Just end of story, period. And of course, I was disappointed because, I always like to be of service and help people. But over the next few days, I had the realization that it didn't matter what strategy I offered her. There were no solutions in the world for her, because she convinced herself that the time did not exist. And I wasn't going to budge that belief. Well, the fact is there are time-saving strategies that can help you work around almost any meal-making challenges, but only if you believe in the possibility that they can work. And after that conversation, it dawned on me that we face a bigger, more fundamental problem around meal making. And it's not just that we lack cooking skills and kitchen fundamentals. We're lacking a belief in the possibility that meal making can be doable by busy modern people. And I say that that's the fault of our modern food culture. And you think about it, when we're busy and we dial for takeout or we drop by a restaurant, throw pizza in the oven or whatever, we're buying into a whole culture created by the food industry. And that culture, or I call it a pseudo culture because it's really based in falsehoods, it revolves around a script that says, first, we're all way too busy to cook. Other things in our lives are way more important than making meals. There's a much more efficient and modern way of taking care of your food needs. You just buy convenience foods. And anyway, food is just something to fill us up. Doesn't matter what you fill up with, just so it tastes good. And by the way, don't worry about your health. Of course, big food companies wouldn't feed you anything unsafe or bad. The government's keeping an eye on them. So just like you talked about myths, these are myths created by companies that need to hawk fast foods. And what these myths have led us to is a sick nation, even though we spend about a fifth of our GDP on healthcare. And the sad thing is about 70% of our sicknesses could be prevented and remediated by addressing lifestyle factors. And of course, food is one of the biggest of those. But our cultural beliefs around food are sabotaging us. You know you can't buy good nutrition in microwavable boxes. We need to make our own health-giving meals to experience optimal health. But then we have a food culture that's barring us from the kitchen. It's keeping us out of the very place where we could save our health. And it's keeping us from cooking, the one activity that will allow us to retake control of our meals and eating. It's just this crazy catch-22.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I think of a book I read recently, and there was this quote that stood out to me, and it is, our body is designed by the food we eat. And I think we all used to believe that, and somehow, like you're talking about, we've bought into these messages about it being kind of old-fashioned, like you said. And I really resonate with that, and with what you're saying about we have to go to the kitchen. You know, for the clients I work with, and for on my own food and body journey, I found, if we hate our body, and we become afraid of food. And so we're also very likely to be afraid of the kitchen because there's food in there and it feels like it has more power than we do. And so we're afraid of preparing meals, of anything having to do with consciously approaching food and eating. And so the overarching fear is I'm going to lose control in there. So getting back to the basics of connecting with whole, real food by focusing on what you do, which is helping people learn about preparation and nourishment, is just so important on the journey. And it's crazy that we've gotten divorced from the kitchen where we could actually do that, where we could actually make some peace with this process and get back to basics and to some of those simple strategies that are actually so powerful. So do you know what happened that got us to this place?
Well, I've been pondering that question for quite a while because, I'd look back at history and I have to believe it's unlikely you had cultures that just thumb their noses at food and meal making, right? Quite the opposite. It was the number one priority. If you didn't pay attention to where your food was going to come from, how you'd get it, how you'd prepare it, you probably starve. I tell people our number one job as a species is to feed ourselves so we can survive and perpetuate the human race. And now we're in this crazy position where we've got the first generation coming along that's on its way to actually reverse things by eating so poorly that their lifespan will be shorter than the previous generation.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Mm-hmm. So it's really a good question. How did such a crazy result happen, especially in one of the wealthiest nations and in one of the wealthiest times in history? How did our food lives get so devalued and neglected that we no longer know how to eat, the basic fundamental function of any living creature? Well, fortunately, I discovered a very enlightening book with some answers. It's called Something from the Oven by Laura Shapiro, and she's a food researcher and historian. Shapiro shares kitchen history from around the 50s and 60s, and that was, of course, right after World War II. And at that time, food manufacturers had developed all sorts of new technologies, and it created this vast industrial system to be able to feed our troops during the war. But then when the war ended, they needed to find new markets so that their wartime investments didn't go to waste. So they took aim at home consumers. Mm-hmm. And at first, homemakers ignored their ready-made foods. They didn't taste that good, they're more expensive, and they didn't see themselves as being so pressed for time that they needed to sacrifice taste and quality for convenience. Now, isn't that interesting? And there's actual studies out that show that. But the food manufacturing industry was undeterred. And year after year, it engaged in, and I'm quoting from Laura Shapiro here, they engaged in a massive campaign against traditional cooking. And to combat women's stubborn and insensible affinity for cooking, food makers, they decided to fabricate a new view of what it means to cook. So their ads, and again I quote, dismissed as outmoded any chore more laborious than applying a finishing touch to a prepared food. And then they began to carefully and persistently convince women that they really didn't have time to cook, even though studies did show, like I mentioned, that most women had no trouble finding enough time to make meals for their families at that time. Well, in the end, it's no secret who won the war. This war. I don't know if we've won your war yet, but they've won that war. Once we had a kitchen culture that embraced and valued cooking from real whole foods, the industrial food system replaced it with a culture that celebrated and not being in the kitchen, not engaging with our food, not knowing what we were eating, and putting convenience above all else. And in that culture, the healthfulness of our food was the last thing on anybody's mind. And not only has convenience eating led to a massive deterioration in our health, but it's deeply ingrained the cultural assumptions that food is not important, cooking certainly isn't important, and no one should spend time in the kitchen. So it's no surprise we can't find time to cook. When an activity's been so devalued, it's tough to see it as worthy of your time. So instead, our time goes to all the other things in our lives that are deemed more valuable and really important. Except there's that one thing that's the foundation for everything else we do, that's just feeding ourselves well, and that's what's really important. And so, you talked about righteous anger, and that's something I've been thinking about too, because why aren't we more angry and taking up our forks and knives in arms? Why are we allowing the industrial food system to manipulate us into doing things that harm and sicken it? That's just wild.
It is wild. It's a little crazy. And it's, I don't think any of us are exempt from that. And we're all working on it. But, I guess the question is, if you're ready to stop being manipulated and start acting in your own self-interest, how do you do that? So I bet you have some good advice for people.
Well, I have two things. One is awareness, and the other is patient attention and conscious shifting. And let me start with awareness. I think awareness has ought to be the starting point, because that's what's so tricky about cultural norms. They blend into the background. They're the unwritten rules that everybody just accepts and that keeps things orderly in our culture. And the point is that you don't have to exert a lot of energy to think about them and figure them out over and over. They just get ingrained and you just follow them automatically. That's the point. And that's great, unless and until those norms are found to be not in our best interest. And especially when we discover that these norms were created and marketed to us not out of our well-being, but to advance the profit motives of private corporations. Our well-being doesn't even figure into the food culture that the industry has conditioned us to believe. So this is why I think awareness and understanding of what's going on has got to be the starting point. You've got to figure out what's happening to you. And raising this awareness is what my upcoming book will be about, sharing how we ended up in the 21st century with our brains completely skewed around food. And I think the more we understand this crazy phenomenon, then the more that we can tackle it. And the interesting thing is that once you become aware, you begin to see through all the food marketing gimmicks that we're exposed to. And you start seeing it from a new perspective and see those hidden messages that are meant to divorce us from making and eating real, whole, health-giving foods. And so once you get your awareness in place, and then the dominoes will start falling. Well, this is where you can begin moving to the second stage, which is patient attention and conscious shifting. And this is where we replace that pseudo culture with something new and better and more supportive. And that's where the second part of my book will be about, is advancing and advocating for a new kitchen culture that returns us to our roots. Those roots where we intrinsically value the role of food in our lives. We truly see it as the foundation of everything else we do, which it is. You don't go far without health-giving food. And when we see it as such a worthy part of our lives, we're able to figure out and find the time to make foods that serve our health. You know, like we all have tons and tons of reasons why we can't make nurturing and nourishing foods. And whether it's a super busy job or kids and at home, or you're cooking just for one, or your food budget is limited, no one is exempt from these pressures of modern life. The question is whether you employ a new kitchen or a new cooking strategy to get around it. And that, in turn, depends on whether you're starting to become new in your kitchen thinking. And that's where the patient attention and conscious shifting comes in. Start paying attention when one of those barriers raises its head and take a close look at it. And then think about how you'd react to that barrier if you came at it from a new perspective, one that truly valued the vital role that food plays in our lives. If you saw food as something deeply worthy, would you find the time, energy, and money to strategize through your barriers? And I'll bet you would. And ultimately, as more and more of us pay attention and question and shift our responses, I look forward to seeing a broader cultural paradigm shift around food. No longer will it be seen as just a necessary intrusion on life, something to fill you up so hunger doesn't distract you. Instead, it will be seen as a beautiful, life-giving gift that it is. You mentioned how it should be joyful. Yeah. And in the new kitchen culture, food will be celebrated, revered, and honored for its life-sustaining and health-giving abilities.
Love it.
Yeah. So that's why we connected on this idea. I love how our work bridges together around this idea of culture. I'm talking about the way our culture has divorced us from life-giving nurture of the kitchen. You're talking about how our culture has put us at war with food and our bodies. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're both talking about overcoming these powerful myths that are out there about all the things you mentioned with cooking and food, and for me with a healthy relationship with food and with your body, and finding some self-love instead of always trying to fix something or improve something in the body.
Well, and on that topic, you had so many powerful and tender and insightful stories in your book, and they really helped me understand what you're talking about. Is there one you could share to illustrate how, our body image culture, what it's done to us?
Sure. Yeah. I think a pivotal story I write about in the book is one that really shifted me from being kind of a tomboy who I just ate food when I was hungry, and I stopped eating when I was full, and I saw my body as this vehicle for doing all of the things I wanted to do as a kid. And things like I loved to run and ride my bike and play basketball and just use my body physically. And so when I was 13, something happened that really shifted that for me. It's a short story. I'll just read it here from the book. It is after school on a spring day like any other. I'm walking to track practice when a passing teacher exclaims, "Wow, you're really getting some hips on you." Her tone of voice clearly indicates the lack of compliment. My face flames as I hurry by her, pulling at my shorts in an attempt to hide my suddenly hideous 13-year-old body. My life shifts dramatically, the unfamiliar sensation of body shame coursing through me. My emotional pain has found a home. So that shifted everything for me. Suddenly I shifted my attention to my body and that it wasn't okay. And and everything really changed from there for me.
Yeah, that's a pretty moving story. And what was so interesting for me when I read that story and other ones is that it made me realize that this isn't just a book for people who might be experiencing food disorders. It's like we're all somewhere on this spectrum. And I saw this for myself. like I've had those kind of stories too. Like, but my mother would always say things like, "You eat so much." And it was just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh my God. And I think I was like you. I was like a tomboy. I love to use my body. And I realized too that, and now I can look back and realize that it was coming from my mother being from a culture where women were supposed to be very dainty eaters. But
Ah,
I'm
yes.
not a dainty person, and I love food and I love to eat horrors.
Oh my goodness, no.
Yet I never dealt with the hurt and anger that her comments provoked. I didn't even know that there was something to deal with. I just let it stew and make me feel bad about what I eat. And that's why I'm really enlightened by your book. It's like,
Mm.
maybe I ought to explore that a little bit.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that I speak with a woman who, um, actually, I think, except for one instance, I don't think I've ever met a woman who doesn't have stories about something, some judgmental, hurtful thing someone said to them about their body or their weight. I have one friend that absolutely loves her body, feels great about it. And she's not like a stereotypical thin woman. She wouldn't meet any of these mythical stereotypes. She's, the stereotypes would say she probably needs to lose a little weight or, whatever. But that's been the one instance of someone who didn't really have a story about something related to their body. So it's very pervasive.
Yes, yes. And I think she was probably definitely an outlier.
Yes, definitely.
Earlier, you asked me how people can break free from a toxic culture, and I talked about awareness and shifting our mindsets. One of the things that I love about your book is that it doesn't just offer insights into what the food war is about and what our culture has done, but also how to end the food war and make peace.
Hmm.
And am I correct that that's what your subtitle of your book is about, the 10 practices to end the war?
Yeah. So what I wanted to do when I wrote the book is make it a really practical, simple way to start addressing the food and body relationship, because there's so much information out there. Unfortunately, a lot of it is about weight loss, but there's so much information about there where the writer is trying to make a specific prescription for everyone to follow, and if they just follow that, um, they'll reach this, whatever this nirvana place of body and food is. And my approach is more about there's 10 practices that I use that were very helpful for me, and they can just be adjusted to work for each person in their own way. They're practices ranging from more practical things like how to make exercise more playful, how to find some moderation and balance in what you eat, to things that are maybe a little deeper and even have a spiritual bent, like finding stillness to get in touch with your body, learning to mother yourself, take care of yourself as much as you care for others, things like that. So the practices, there's a big range there.
One of the things I think is the neatest about your book, Terri, is that you said short. Your book is short. I hope
Mhm.
listeners understand that. It's something that you can read in a day. And yet these 10 practices, they're simple, but they're so powerful. And it's great because you don't have to get you don't have to get into something really heavy, really involved. They just get you started, and they're really wonderful. I mean, you can just pick them up and practice them right away. You don't have to have a long waiting period. You can just get right after them.
Yes, and that was the whole idea. And most people have told me they read the book in a couple hours, and then after each practice, there's a section with some very practical ways to start applying the practice in your life, and that's where people can go back and start using the book as a workbook. But you're right. There's always you can just start right away to use some of these to get some relief for what you're dealing with food or body image. So.
Well, can you give us an example of one of those practices and go into a little more depth on just one of them?
Yeah, sure. And I'm actually in, this might sound weird, but I'm gonna talk about the least popular practice, which is
That's
which
okay.
is then the one that kind of surprises people the most, and that's practice number one, which is to ditch your weight loss goal. And that really takes people off guard, because a lot of times when we're dealing with food and body issues, the first thing people think is, if I can just lose, X amount of weight, then I'll love myself, then I'll learn how to eat, then I'll, all these things that we're waiting to achieve. And what I'm proposing and what I have seen great success with is when you take the idea of self-love and self-acceptance first. Set weight loss goals aside, set those I have to be a certain way, those ideas aside, and work on, I'm going to accept myself right now. Something that I call weight normalization starts to happen. And that's where you start listening to your body's signals. Am I hungry? Am I full? What food makes me feel good? And you and I are going to talk more about that later on in the podcast. And when you start listening to those signals, our weight starts to move toward a weight that's normal for our body. And so it's a practice that takes some getting used to, because women are just so used to being on this weight loss train. And but it's probably the most freeing of all the practices once you really adopt it and work with it. So, and I know, Mary, you're on the same wavelength when it comes to tools that are practical and easy to implement.
Yeah, that's why I call myself a healthy eating implementer, as I mentioned earlier. Because ever since I began in this field, I noticed there's plenty of information out there telling us what we should be eating. You know, and you just mentioned it, all those diets. There's the paleo, the plant-based, the vegan, the low-fat, the high-fat, and no end to all the articles about how you should eat this food, or kale, or jackfruit, or acai berries, and, you know, all sorts of warnings about make sure you get enough EFAs and flavonoids and on and on. We know this. The issue is change. How do we do it? How do we implement all this good advice in a way so that we can be eating comfortably and in a way that really benefits us? Because what happens when you go home and you open the fridge? Are there at least 2 or 3 good vegetables that you know how to cook and that you would and cook tonight? Or are there only a few takeout containers containing exactly the kind of food you don't want to be eating? And do your cupboards have some jars of whole grains? Have you cooked one in advance so you're not waiting an hour before you eat dinner? In fact, do you even have any idea what to cook that's not the same boring old unhealthy thing? Well, once you've committed to a new kitchen culture that honors food and meal making, then let me share the practical tools that can make that happen. And these are the part of the new kitchen way that's all about being new in the kitchen. And Terri, just like you had the 10 practices to end the body image war, I have 6 kitchen smart strategies to overcome the kitchen barriers that block your way to making good everyday meals. And I'll just go over those real quickly. Number 1 is know what you're going to make before you head to the kitchen to start making a meal. Number 2, find new, healthier recipes and keep them organized so you can find them when you need them. Number 3, create a hassle-free workspace. Make sure you're not weighted down by counter clutter, disaster cupboards, and ingredients and equipment that you've stashed in random, ever-changing locations. Number 4, make sure you have a helpful and healthy pantry. Number 5, have the right equipment. And surprisingly, you don't need very much, but you do need that much to make decent meals with ease. And then number 6, tame your grocery shopping time so you're not chased away from making good meals by the grocery store. And these sound so simple, don't they?
They do. It would be helpful for me to hear a more detailed example too.
Let me talk about the very first one of them, because it's also the most powerful. And that's the one about knowing what you're going to make before you head to the kitchen, otherwise known as the think ahead and plan habit. And this habit's so important that I offer a whole separate 4-week workshop just to help you develop it. And what we learn is why it's so important. And really, that isn't so hard to understand. You know that if you walk in the kitchen without a plan, all sorts of problems will start raining down. You'll waste precious minutes trying to figure out something to make. You don't have minutes to spare to begin with. Your brain won't be thinking well because you're starving, and maybe others in your household will be chomping in a bit too. And if you find something to make, there's a really good chance, 1, that you'll waste more minutes trying to find the recipe. 2, you'll end up missing 1 or more ingredients. 3, there's a really good chance it'll be the same old thing you always make. And 4, because it's the same old thing, it's not the new, more wholesome kind of food you want to be eating. And that causes all sorts of stress and angst, and that's not good for anybody. So like I said, this isn't hard to understand. In fact, we've probably all experienced it, maybe a lot.
Yeah, I sure have.
You can hear that. Conversely, it's not hard to understand how all these problems disappear when you take the time in advance of meal making to figure out a game plan. The hard part of this strategy is putting that understanding into practice. We know that we're going to face a culinary fiasco if we race into the kitchen without a plan. We know that.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it, and how is it that, how can we reorient our thinking to support the plan ahead habit? That's the really tricky part of this Kitchen Smart strategy, and that's what we focus on a lot in my workshop. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I just had that happen last night. My husband and I were both hungry, and I had this great recipe, and I was missing two things. And I hadn't planned ahead. I really try to, and I really work on that, but I did not plan ahead last night. So we ended up going out. We went out for a healthy meal, but it wasn't cooked in our kitchen. And so I totally relate to that example.
Well, thank you for that timely interjection. How perfect. Oh, goodness. We've had a chance now to talk about the dangers posed by our food culture. So maybe it's time to circle back to that second area where I think we share a lot of commonality, and that's the idea of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, when you first mentioned this, I thought that was an odd pairing, food and freedom. So talk to me about, how do you put those together?
Well, I think for me, I see freedom as, especially with food, as being able to eat with joy in a way that satisfies both your body and your spirit. Because I find, after years of restrictive eating and guilt-laden eating, that there was no joy in that, and my body didn't feel good and my spirit didn't feel good. And so I think that means several things. I think it means tuning out the external noise, all the messages we're getting out there, and focusing instead on this inner wisdom we all have. It's about listening to what our body says about the food we eat. It eventually leads to those healthier choices you and I have both talked about. Because for me, if I, for instance, eat a moderate amount of chocolate, it's wonderful. It's such a pleasurable treat. If I eat too much, I get a headache. And it happens every time, so it's not a coincidence. And so I know that about my body. That's just one small example. I think freedom means, especially if someone is on the end of the spectrum of eating disorder, but even there's something called disordered eating, and many of us are kind of more in that area. So freedom means being free from dieting. Our bodies have this built-in portion control sensor, and it's called our hunger signals. And it's probably one of the most common questions I get from people, or frustrations that people have, is, I don't know how to tell if I'm getting the right amount of food. And I think it's just because we've tuned out that sensor, and we're using our other senses of being entertained by food, or what does the food taste like. If we stop long enough to check in, we'll listen to that sensor will tell us, hey, I'm getting full. My body, I've had enough food. And so our body gets the amount of food it needs to function well, to be healthy. And again, that word I used before, that weight normalization, our weight will start to normalize to a level that is right for us. So, and I think there's also some freedom when you start to love your body. Just say, today I'm just going to start loving my body right now, instead of having this constant pressure to try changing it or fixing it. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to be at a healthy weight, but we want to come at that not from restriction and pressure, but from, again, freedom. Just looking at, what does our body need, and are we listening to those signals? And freedom is about being able to put our focus and our energy on the things that really matter to me as a person. So for one person, that'll be a passion around their work or their kids. Another person, it might be a hobby, or it may be something that involves their body, like they may be a runner or like to do 5Ks, or whatever it is. But our focus and energy can be put there. Finding joy and contentment living in this body right now is a lot of freedom. And I also think freedom around food and your body means that you can just begin to harness the power of gratitude. What's presenting to me right now that I can be grateful for, rather than thinking in the future I'll be grateful when my body looks different, or when I'm 5, 10, whatever, 50 pounds lighter. I'll be grateful then. And there's freedom in saying, I'm going to be grateful now. And so there's lots of areas. Those are just some of them. I think I find new areas of freedom every day on this journey when I just keep taking steps toward loving myself, toward eating in a healthy, joyful way. So I'm wondering, how does it fit in for you?
Yes, I'll come back to earth now because I'm sitting here listening to this. This is beautiful. I mean, it's so interesting because I just would have not have put those two and two together like that. So that's really rich, Terri. And, it's interesting because I never thought about my programming in terms of freedom. But when you brought up the topic and how it's a big part of your book, it reminded me of a sense of freedom I felt a long time ago. As I mentioned at the outset, I had two small children who'd been very ill, and overnight I had to completely change my family's diet to heal them. So for 2 years after that, I felt like I was in a state of full to semi-chaos as I raced here and there trying to get meals on the table 3 times a day that met our requirements, our health requirements. And I was able to do it, but just barely. I always felt like I was coming from behind. I definitely felt the exact opposite of free and easy. I felt trapped and oppressed instead. And this is when I discovered the Kitchen Smart strategies, and I started implementing them in my kitchen. And indeed, bit by bit, things became more and more doable. But then there was this tectonic shift around the 2-year mark. I remember that I had most of the pieces of my Kitchen Smart solution in place by then. And all of a sudden, something clicked. In particular, I remember this day when I had a surprising thought. It was getting late in the afternoon, and I realized, and I said to myself, I haven't worried once all day about what to fix for dinner.
Oh,
how am I going to keep
amazing.
my kids healthy? Yeah. And remember that meal planning habit that I talked about? Well, I'd finally gotten the habit down and a shopping system to go with it. So I wasn't plagued all day by what I'm going to fix. Will everyone like it? Is it something I'm not bored with? Do I have the right ingredients? Will it be healthy? I just remember the wonderful lightness of being free of the dread and anxiety that always been part and parcel of mealtimes. And it was amazing. I know that sounds crazy, but it was amazing.
Yeah.
And I lived with it so long. And then suddenly to realize that it wasn't there, it was like, wow.
That's huge.
And so your mention of freedom was a good reminder that freedom is indeed a big part of what the Kitchen Smart system delivers. I've just been taking it for granted. And the freedom that the Kitchen Smart system delivers, I realized, is freedom from the nagging sense that you can't get food and mealtimes under control. They're like a runaway train. You race after it, and you're able to grab a railing and hang on for a bit, but then you fall off and things spiral out of control again. And the feeling of not being in control is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, of course, is just because it gives your whole life a chaotic feel. Because remember, meal times and their issues come up 3 times a day, 7 days a week. So it adds a pretty big stress burden on your life. But as importantly, if meal times aren't under control, it's tough to control what's going into your meals. And that makes it hard to eat the way you really want to be eating. And with ever more information coming out about the importance of what we eat, both to short and long-term health, we end up burdened not just by this chaos, but by fear. Am I doing some damage to my body? And then guilt. Well, I'm not doing enough, Yeah. So the New Kitchen Way is all about getting the mealtime thing under control. And what I discovered is that the key to getting mealtimes under control lies in organization and structure. And it's interesting because usually when we think of organization, we think of it as a straitjacket, not anything to do with freedom. We think rules and rigidity and no fun. But in fact, organization and structure are what creates space that is free of chaos. And being able to operate in a chaos-free space lifts the burden and overwhelm of daily meal making. And so instead of chaos, meal making can flow, it can be efficient, feel smooth and natural, and makes room for something surprising like creativity and fun and relaxation. Did you think you could get those from meal times?
Yeah. Well, how wonderful to be able to get that. And what a wonderful way to approach food in the kitchen rather than with fear and nervousness and
dread. Yeah. Well, Terri, does organization and structure figure into your program? Would it be helpful for people on the spectrum?
I think it really can. I think there's always a fine line to walk with someone who's struggled with the kind of, you mentioned a straitjacket, and a lot of us have been in this dieting straitjacket for years, and so there's a fine line there. But what I think it's important to differentiate between that kind of straitjacket diet kind of mentality and the organization and structure you're talking about, which creates the word we were using is freedom. And you were also using several other words that were so nice, and I forget what they were now, but they were just that lack of chaos and just making things flow and feel smooth and natural. And it's so important for when we've struggled with food in our body to think about, what's going on with me, with my emotions, in my brain before I even go to the kitchen. And a lot of times people on this spectrum, and that's a lot of us, we might head to the kitchen and there's some choices to be made when we get there, and the emotions we've been feeling before we get there may lead us to the cookies, may lead us to the unhealthy choices. But if we've had some organization and structure when we get there, we might choose that to make that healthy dinner or to grab that healthy snack because we've planned it out. And so it's not a have to, it's not a diet, but it's options. And that's where I see it can be so helpful.
So the organization opens up space to have options.
Yeah.
So you've got some choices.
Yeah, having some spaciousness around it. I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know we talked about it too, that sometimes I talk about it as being a security blanket rather than a straitjacket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People that, because sometimes we have some pretty negative feelings around organization.
Yeah. And if you're coming to food with fear, a feeling of fear and what's going to happen, I'm not going to be able to control myself. Just that idea of a security blanket that, well, I've made some plans, and so I have some options. Yeah, I think that can be really powerful.
Oh, great. Well, good. So that's all about freedom. And now maybe let's go on to that third area about healthy eating. It's another area that we had some interesting discussion and connection around the concept of complicity and trusting your innate wisdom. And now, Terri, when we talked, I felt like you had some potential problems with the concept of healthy eating, and I'm putting those in air quotes. And I will admit that as a healthy eating advocate and educator, your stance made me a little nervous at first. Like, eek, you're telling them they can have a Snickers bar? But I think I'm understanding where you're going with it, and that it's a really important first step towards really owning a way of eating that best serves you. So could you explain this a little bit more?
Yes, absolutely. And it's been so fun to talk with you about that as we've been planning this, because I think, yes, the answer is always yes, you can have a Snickers bar. What the underlying message of the Body Love Food Peace approach is that you can have the Snickers bar. And if you go ahead and have it, take time to pay attention to what that does. How does that make your body feel? And once we start to notice that, and once we start pairing that with this loving yourself, that self-love approach, we realize that A, it doesn't make me feel good, and B, it doesn't feel loving to my body. My body hurts right now. And that can, manifest in different ways for everybody. And so there's that freedom in, yes, I can choose a Snickers bar, but what does that mean? And so over time, if you just keep practicing that, I have choices. What does this choice I have made do for me? People without fail are going to gradually move toward healthy eating. So my message is about nurture your body, and it absolutely includes healthy eating. I mean, I'm a health and wellness coach, so that's what I help people discover is, what does body nurture look like for you? What foods make you feel great? What foods make you feel not so great? How can you start to lessen the foods that don't make you feel good and increase the amount of foods that do? So, and the key is staying away from rules, because rules for anybody who has, any kind of disordered eating or issues with food or fear of food, rules mean another diet. And so, I think what does work is a combination of knowledge about healthy cooking and eating and being prepared, like the education you provide, Mary, with listening to the body's messages, which is what I teach. So
neat how those come together.
Yeah, it's so great how they come together. And I think there have been so many epiphanies. You've talked so much about how things you hadn't thought of until you read my book. And there's so many things you're mentioning that I hadn't thought about the connection either. So how preparation is so important. And, there's obvious research about what foods are healthy and nourishing for our body. A vegetable-rich diet is better than one rich in candy bars. Body wisdom will validate that every time. Our own innate wisdom will tell us, yep, my body feels good when I eat certain things and not when I eat the candy bars. So, listening, what does our body want? What happens when we eat it? And The mind will always want the Kit Kat bar. The body will want the healthy food. And so that's a difference we have to watch for. Is our body wants sustenance so it can thrive physically. Our mind wants to be entertained and distracted, and food is a great way to do that. And so you have to be careful am I listening to my body, or am I listening to what my mind wants? And there's a big difference, and it takes some practice. But in the end, if we're listening to our body more often, it's going to choose the healthy stuff.
Terri, you have mentioned several times, this innate wisdom, this body wisdom you've talked about. And I feel like on healthy eating, that's one of the things I like to emphasize too for people, because, people have figured out how to eat to survive for many centuries and millennia, and it's just only in this last 60 years that we've gotten all messed up about what this is. And so one of the things I try to emphasize with people is that healthy eating is actually a lot easier than you think. If you look back over cultures, they ate what nature provided, when nature provided, and they listened to their satisfaction meter. Which is kind of like, your internal, like you called it something else. I've heard it called the satisfaction meter.
Yeah, I love that.
And yet, one of the other things that our food culture has skewed us up in recently, in these last 6 years, is thinking that the only people who can tell us what to eat correctly are people in white lab coats, they've studied this, and they've got a study to back up that you should eat this or that. And that has made eating so confusing, and I think it's led to a lot of, I wonder if it has led to a lot of eating disorders, because we're so confused and we've got so many different things coming at us. And so that's why I really try to focus on what I call the simple prescription for good eating. I came up with for my book clear back in 2005, and I call it a prescription, but that's really loose. What it really is an outline, and it has just 5 guidelines. Number 1, focus on the good. And I think we all know what the good is, right?
Yeah.
Vegetables, fruits, we know that. And by focusing on that, it automatically eliminates the stuff we want to get away from, the artificial additives, the sugar, that kind of stuff. 3, eat a wild diversity of foods. 4, eat in balance and moderation. And 5, enjoy it, for goodness sakes.
Especially, yes.
And really, as I have seen the studies coming down over my 25 years, they all boil down to that one simple prescription, or really outline, as I called it.
I love that. And if it's an outline, people still feel like they have the control, which is so important. It's not something they have to do, but they have some choices. And so I love that.
So this is great. And well, I think we're about ready to wrap up. And I just want to mention that both Terri and I have talked about how the learning and the knowledge and understandings that we share are really about a journey. Like learning to think a new way and explore a new type of culture, it doesn't happen overnight. And so that's why I always talk to people about this is a journey. And I want to encourage people to have patience and enjoy along the way. Because here's one of the good news is that you don't have to reach the end of the journey before all the benefits begin. Every time you do one little kitchen smart step, make one little bit of progress with your thinking, learn one new thing about cooking, you're going to experience benefits all along the way of the journey. And it's a fun journey. I've been doing it for 25 years, and just there's still so much to learn. And so it's good stuff.
It is.
Do you find that too, Terri?
Yes, I call the Body Love Food Peace journey a recovery journey. And I think of it as we're recovering our body wisdom, like what our body has always known, and we're recovering that. And so it takes time, because most of us for years have not been listening to that. So it's a step-by-step process. We learn from our mistakes we make. I learn the most from the mistakes I make. And I'm on the journey too, and always will be. So.
Yeah, we will be. Yeah, exactly. Well, I hope everyone's gained some new and helpful insights from our conversation around culture, food freedom, and healthy eating. And of course, if you'd like to know more, we've got resources listed below this video. Please check them out. And that includes information about Terri's book and about my upcoming classes and workshops. And for sure, we'd like to hear from all of you, as I mentioned at the outset. So if we've provoked some thoughts or questions, be sure to write a comment below and we'll get back to you. And with that, we want to just say thanks. And from my part, happy and healthy meal making, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Bye now.